And I'm going to start with the example of using biomass, so renewable carbon as a input for things like making plastics, making fuel, perhaps making pharmaceuticals. So replacing fossil fuels with renewable biomass. We understand how it would work. The challenge, I think, is that whether it's fossil fuels or whether it's biomass, we have been creating an increasingly industrial society. So we are seeing the depopulation of the rural landscape and the creation of megacities. So I'm looking at on a global scale, not just particularly at the Australian model, although we're also seeing our rural population decline and our urban population increase in an already highly urbanised continent. And so the exciting as the prospect of seeing the industrial applications of biomass to create all of those things and replacing fossil fuel would seem to me to be increasing the ongoing industrialisation of society. Could you talk about whether you think that's true, whether you think that's important, and what you think the vision of the future is in that context?
Well, Geoff, the questions you've asked relate a bit to the bigger question that's sometimes asked about whether economic growth can continue without serious destabilisation of the natural environment that makes our civilization possible. And very important, we've got a clear idea about what we mean by economic growth. Economic growth is rising living standards. It can come from increasing the amount of capital that each person uses in what they make, how they do their work. It can increase it. It can come from improved technology, from technological change. It can come from growth of population. More or less, by definition, we can't have continued population growth forever on this finite planet. Really good news there, and it's a story of development, is wherever countries have succeeded with economic development, with rising living standards, fertility has fallen below replacement levels, to the extent that in the world outside Africa we're pretty well at zero population growth levels of fertility now, and probably heading for population decline. Unfortunately, we don't yet have the substantial growth in living standards in Africa that would do the same thing there. So fertility is still very high, population is still very high. We could end up late this century with more humans in Africa than in the rest of the world.
Do you have a number for an optimum population for the planet?
No, I don't have a number, but I think we'd be better off if it was declining, and the only realistic path to that is to extend to Africa the development that has raised living standards in the rest of the world. So we've got to have the economic growth at least to do that, but otherwise we won't get fertility and population decline in Africa, and therefore we won't get a cap on population in the world as a whole. But for the rest of humanity, we can have rising living standards without increased pressure on the environment. I've seen that happen myself. I've been visiting Japan professionally for more than half a century, and when I first started going to Japan, late 60s, early 70s, the air of Japan was more polluted than in the big cities than anywhere on earth. Tokyo, however, didn't have a living fish in it. From the suburbs of Tokyo, you couldn't see Mount Fuji on any sort of day, in any sort of weather. Well, that's all changed, and Japan's much richer now. Japan changed the relationship between economic activity and pressure on the environment. It came to use much less energy, have much less pollution, and technological change can focus growth into areas that that can reverse pressure on the environment. We can have better health services, better education services without increasing pressure on the environment. We can make things in different ways. Now, you raised a particular challenge of biomass, and there, to be sure, we have to be careful about how we manage increased output of biomass for industry, and certainly not the only thing we want to do. We have to be mindful of the value of biodiversity. We have to be mindful of the value of carbon in the soils and in living plants. That's going to be an important part of the achievement of zero net emissions in the world as a whole. But there are ways that we can look after those interests and also have sustainable production of biomass, especially if we're avoiding use of land profligately in many of the ways that we use it now. So I think we can radically change the nature between human living standards, including quality of education services, health standards, and pressures on the environment. That's to do with doing things in a different way. That's to do with technological improvement.
Okay, so there's quite a lot of things in there that I'd like to unpack. So I'm going to start with a few quick, easy ones. My understanding is that the Japanese economy in terms of GDP measurement has been fairly flat for about the last 3 decades. Am I reading that incorrectly?
No, it's been, 3 decades. The increase has been moderate. Japanese population is now declining. Japanese output per person has been increasing, but it's been increasing in ways that haven't increased pressure on the environment. Now, Japanese population is declining partly because they're prosperous and wealthy, and it's a law of nature to which there's no exception, that once people reach those living standards, fertility declines and population decline follows unless you have large immigration. Well, that's where Japan is. But hasn't the Japanese government resisted calls for immigration and external borrowing to restart and re-kick their economy in ways that would suit the rest of the world? Oh, certainly Japan doesn't do any external borrowing on balance because they save so much themselves. They're a big lender to the rest of the world. But Japanese output per person has been increasing in the last decade, faster than Australia's. Australia's bottom of the list in terms of growth in output per person. If you like zero growth in living standards, then Australia's top of the developed country tree in the 7 years before the pandemic recession. Unfortunately, the people who suffered that stagnation of living standards were mainly Australians on low incomes, but Japan's had some increase in average output, but it's done that in ways that have reduced pressure on the environment.
So some of those ways are technology, so we need to talk about the role of technology and the impact equals population times affluence times technology equation. And so that goes to the decoupling issue. But before we jump to that, I just want to talk about the role of increasing our living standards through things like education or entertainment, the other things that you talked about us being able to buy and sell. Yeah. Rather than things. We've got enough things, we've got enough stuff in our homes, we don't need more of that, but we might want to, buy services and education, knowledge. Yeah. I'm old enough to remember leisure studies in the 70s, and my first jobs in technology were all about automating menial tasks so that we had more leisure time. But the need for economic growth has made us sort of see that we wanted to work harder instead of having more leisure time. When we talk about buying services and buying education and buying entertainment, we're sort of combining leisure and economic growth. Could you just talk to that issue?
Yeah, if you go back nearly 100 years, John Maynard Keynes, I think the most important public intellectual of the 20th century, wrote an essay for his students in Cambridge in the early 1930s called The Economics of Our Grandchildren. That was 1931. He said in 100 years' time, capital will be abundant, labour will be scarce, and people won't have great high income simply because they own capital. Interest rates will be low, and productivity will have increased so much that we will be able to achieve our wants with much less work, much more leisure. Well, when you analyse what's actually happened, I think he was right. But we've taken leisure in ways that might have surprised him. We've taken a lot of the drudgery out of housework, which used to keep women in the household employed in drudgery. A full day of washing through hand mechanisms and the cleaning without modern appliances. So we've chosen now today a lot more women participate in the labour force in ways that give them a lot more freedom and a lot more satisfaction, certainly a lot more choice. That they've chosen to use freedom from the old household drudgery to enter employment in other ways. I think when you break it all down, there is less really difficult, heavy work. We work hard to buy to earn the money to buy a daily cup of coffee when we once would have made that ourselves. A lot of the transfers are rather complicated ones, but when you look at how we use our time, there's a lot less drudge and drudge work.
Haven't we also created what David Graeber, for example, calls bullshit jobs? That's the name of his book about, one of the toxic effects of our focus on economic growth, that we create jobs to create full employment. We're following each other around with clipboards, measuring everything we do. We're uploading 47 days of video to online networks every hour, and some of our economy seems to be an artifice to maintain economic growth that may or may not be contributing to an actual beneficial lifestyle.
Well, I don't think anyone's planning to maintain economic growth by having us consume useless things.
Don't you?
No, I think we're doing that ourselves, and
so that's a human instinct rather than a corporate.
And we can break free of that individually. We can choose to ride a bike to work.
Okay.
Ride a bike across town. I do, and I think it's much more efficient, apart from being much more enjoyable. And over time we'll learn to, I hope we'll learn to use our leisure better. Unfortunately, some of the ways that we enjoy ourselves seem to involve less and less of the higher cultures, and I think the internet's contributed to some downgrading of culture in those effects. But we do have to put more effort into using what money we have and what time we have in ways that are more uplifting.
That goes to my concern about replacing fossil fuels with biomass or with, say, hydrogen generated from solar power used to extract the hydrogen from water. We can decouple the economic growth from those carbon-emitting exercises if that's our focus, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're creating a better lifestyle. If we're all slaves to the economy and we're on a treadmill living in mega cities and wilderness becomes a sort of theme park that we go and play in at certain times, I'm not sure that that's a picture of a future that everyone would welcome. I'm thinking of Tim Flannery's book about Europe recently, where he was talking about the rewilding of Europe due to the increased productivity and efficiency in some of the ways that I think are similar to what you're proposing. But some of the critics of that scenario have said, yes, well, that depends on the raping and pillaging that European countries do on other continents. You know, they're getting their biofuel from Africa and so on.
Yeah. Well, for a start, I don't think biofuel makes much sense. You can produce energy much more cheaply by using the sun and the wind, and storing it when you need to in a battery or a couple of dams away from rivers.
Bioplastics and pharmaceuticals.
But bioplastics, yes. There are some uses, some sources of plastics and petrochemicals that can be made without using biomass, but there'll be some of the things that we want to consume and that have a valid place in a good human life will require hydrocarbons of the kind that can only come from fossil fuels or biomass. I think we can produce those consistently with the rewilding of Europe. You can rewild Europe and have sustainable harvesting of some products, and I don't think that the good living standard that Europe has today does depend on pillaging the rest of the earth, and as time goes on, we'll become better and better at doing getting what we need in other ways. Take, for example, the satisfactions that 90% of humans get from eating meat in some form. We can now enjoy meat without having the intermediary of the cow, at least the same nutrients and comparable taste, and you'll be able to get that with probably a seventh of the pressure on land that you get from growing cattle or sheep, and a combination of that and changing tastes will radically change the relationship between the satisfaction we get from eating and pressure on the environment.
Yes, well, I won't labour the point about whether that's a science fiction world that people do or don't want to live in, because that's where I was going and you've answered that. I just want to sort of finish up by looking at the role of technology in the impact equals population times affluence times technology equation. So you've talked about the ability to decouple economic growth from the impact that we currently see economic growth having. Some of the critics of the notion of decoupling point out that the efforts we've made so far to use technology to continue to increase our affluence have not been terribly efficient, and that to reduce the impact to the number of orders of magnitude we need to prevent disastrous climate change mean that we need many more orders of magnitude of improvements in technological efficiency. So that's a major problem with the notion of being able to decouple. Can you just address that?
I think that if Australia set about it with real intent, we could have zero emissions in the 2030s. Not only have zero emissions, but contribute to getting rid of somewhere between 7 and 9% of global emissions. Now that's not a bad contribution for something like 1/3% of the world's population. If we use our sun and our wind to make electricity, to make hydrogen, to turn our iron ore into iron metal, then just in the iron ore exports that we make to the rest of the world and that are currently converted by use of coal, a lot of it our own coal, into iron and steel, converting that to hydrogen made from renewable energy being the reductant would reduce global emissions by 3%. That's 3 times Australia's current total emissions. So we decarbonise ourselves by the 2030s. We turn our own iron ore into iron metal by the 2030s, supply the rest of the world with zero emissions iron. We've reduced global emissions by 4%. Do the same with our aluminium ores, which we export to the world. We turn them into aluminium metal using Australian solar and wind, and we've reduced global emissions by another 1 or 2%. So it's no fantasy to think that we could have zero emissions economic activity in Australia by the mid-30s. We could contribute many times that amount to the global decarbonisation effort through cleverly using our own renewable energy resources. The world as a whole can deal with climate change by having zero emissions. That we don't is a function of the flaws in our political system. And in a democracy, when you're getting bad policy outcomes, sure, you can point to corruption of the policy process, the role of money in the policy process, but we've got a lot of influence ourselves as citizens. As Shakespeare would have said, the flaws are not in our fates but in ourselves.
Excellent. Well, that's a very powerful statement about the climate and the emissions. The other challenge that we have are the social justice issues, the equitable sharing. You mentioned Africa. The fact that 2 of your 4 main pillars of in Reset are about the universal basic income and not your term, but that idea. And again, rentierism, not your term, but your idea of taxing cash flow rather than income, address social justice rather than environmental issues means that the problem's not just one of carbon emissions. And so the danger is that we create a carbon efficient economy that prevents us from dying from climate change, but we continue to exploit a big chunk of the population and not address those social issues. So do you want to talk to that for a moment?
Yeah, well, anyone who's followed my work for the last 50 years would not accuse me of emphasising climate to the detriment of social justice. And my own view is that unless we deal with the social justice issues, we'll lose our democracy, and I think that would be tragic. Without dealing with social justice issues, then democracy throws up people like President Trump, manipulated by the Koch brothers and Rupert Murdoch and Fox News, and it's only a matter of time that democracy loses out in systemic competition with authoritarian regimes that have very damaging effects on many values that are hugely important to us, but nevertheless don't have some of the detrimental effects on ordinary people that a continuation of Trump-like control of the democratic process would have. So social justice issues are essential for the success of democracy. I think that democracy is essential for the realisation of our potential as a civilization. It would be the end of most of the things that we think are good. If we lost our democracy, we won't live in a good democratic world in future unless we can make democracy work for social justice. I've got a couple of practical suggestions in Reset, but of course that's only part of the story. It's a big struggle, but it's the crucial struggle. We've got to deal with climate and challenges to the stability of our environment. We've got to deal with social justice, and both of those things are conditions for the continued success of our democracy and the preservation of democratic freedoms.
Well, on that note, Professor Garnaut, I think we'll release you from the cage
Phew, I was worried there for a while with all your hard questions, but glad I made it.